Most people assume that throughout history, survival in war or disaster depended primarily on weapons, food stores, and physical fortifications. Communication is treated as secondary, a supporting detail, a background mechanism. Yet in reality, entire civilizations have collapsed, not because they lacked strength or resources, but because they lost the ability to signal, coordinate, and transmit information under pressure. When communication failed, relief never arrived, defenses fractured, and communities were isolated into silence. Long before radios and satellites, survival hinged on systems of signaling that were precise, disciplined, and often invisible to outsiders. What is often overlooked is that these systems were not improvised in moments of crisis. They were built deliberately, refined over generations, and embedded into the geography and culture of a people. To understand survival in the ancient world, and even in the modern conflicts of the 20th century, we have to look closely at how information moved when there were no wires, no encryption algorithms, and no global networks, only light, sound, memory, and human endurance. The lost art of survival communication. Long before electronic networks, communication systems were actually engineered into the landscape itself. Ancient civilizations understood that, the speed of information could determine whether a frontier settlement lived or died. The Persian Empire, for instance, built one of the earliest and most disciplined courier networks in history. Herodotus described mounted riders stationed at regular intervals, able to relay messages across thousands of kilometers with remarkable efficiency. The system was not simply logistical, it was strategic redundancy. Each rider knew only his segment. If captured, the larger network remained intact. Survival depended on compartmentalization. But couriers were only one layer. In ancient Greece, beacon chains linked mountain peaks from Asia Minor to mainland cities. A prearranged code allowed news, such as the fall of a city, to travel hundreds of miles in just a few hours. This was not improvisation. It required synchronized preparation, line-of-sight surveying, and constant maintenance. A broken link in the chain meant darkness and uncertainty. The lesson here is structural. These societies treated communication infrastructure as seriously as walls or weapons. They built signaling capacity into terrain. Elevated towers, cleared sightlines, and relay stations were survival investments. When we examine later military doctrine, especially in the 20th century, we see this principle re-emerge. Communication nodes are strategic targets precisely because they determine whether a force can coordinate under stress. Signal fires and coded light were not primitive, they were disciplined languages. There is a tendency to dismiss ancient signal fires as crude alarms. Light a flame, warn the village. In reality, many systems evolved into coded exchanges. The Greek historian Polybius described a torch-based grid system that could transmit letters by number sequences. It required training, literacy, and rehearsed interpretation. Misreading a signal could mobilize troops unnecessarily or, fail to warn of real danger. In East Asia, beacon towers along the Great Wall operated on layered codes. The number of smoke plumes or fires indicated the size of an approaching force. These signals were standardized, monitored, and enforced with strict accountability. False alarms were punishable offenses. Accuracy was, honestly, a survival imperative. What matters here is the discipline behind the signal. Survival communication is not about noise, it's about clarity under constraint. Interestingly, the same principle appears centuries later in wartime radio procedure. During World War II, brevity codes and standardized phrases reduced confusion and minimized transmission time. The ancient world, actually anticipated this logic, compress meaning into repeatable forms that withstand stress. Sound carried through forests and valleys where light could not reach. In regions where mountains or dense forests blocked line of sight, sound became the medium of survival. Drums in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia transmitted rhythm-based messages across long distances. These were not random beats, but tonal patterns corresponding to language structures. Communities could communicate warnings, announcements, and mobilization signals without a written script. In medieval Europe, church bells served a parallel function. Different ringing patterns signaled fire, invasion, or assembly. The bell tower was both religious and defensive infrastructure. It anchored the community's auditory awareness. The important element is not romanticism about drums or bells, it is redundancy. When one medium failed, like, say, fog obscuring beacons or storms extinguishing flames, another channel carried the message. In 20th century warfare, this redundancy became doctrine. Armies learned to maintain wire, radio, runner, and visual signaling simultaneously. If artillery cut the telephone lines, a runner moved. Ancient systems really anticipated this kind of layered approach. They didn't just rely on a single method, not at all. Survival communication back then actually required a fair bit of overlap. Runners and human messengers, well, they reveal the physical cost of information, don't they? Modern viewers, I think, often underestimate the sheer endurance demanded by pre-industrial communication. In Mesoamerica, for example, relay runners carried messages across these vast road systems, and they did it with a speed that honestly surprised early European observers. This vulnerability forced the development of codes and sealed tablets. Even in ancient contexts, encryption, however basic, was a survival tool. The human body was both the carrier and the weakness of the system. 20th century conflicts would mechanize transmission, but the lesson persisted. In both world wars, runners were still used when radio positions were compromised. When communication collapsed, consequences were often irreversible. In various ancient sieges, relief forces arrived too late because signal chains were disrupted or misunderstood. Sometimes weather obscured beacon fires, making it impossible for help to know when to move. And in other instances, enemy forces captured relay stations, breaking the line of communication entirely. The broader pattern is, sobering. Communication breakdown isolates communities psychologically as well as physically. In 20th century encirclements, from the Eastern Front to Pacific Island battles, cut communication produced confusion, rumor, and, all too often, fatal miscalculation. Ancient societies experienced similar fragmentation. Without timely signals, alliances faltered, reinforcements never mobilized. A city that might have endured with coordinated support instead stood alone. This is not simply a technical issue, it's, a human one. Clear communication sustains morale and shared understanding, Its absence, on the other hand, accelerates collapse. Codes, concealment, and deception became survival tools in their own right. Hidden markings, prearranged symbols carved into stone, or subtle alterations in everyday objects could, transmit meaning unnoticed. Modern preparedness discussions often overlook this quiet tradition. Communication does not always require devices. It requires really shared knowledge, agreed signals, and disciplined restraint. When modern armies formalized signal corps in the 19th and 20th centuries, they codified principles that had existed for millennia. Line-of-sight observation posts became standardized. Signal flags and heliographs revived ancient light-based methods. The enduring lesson is that communication is infrastructure, not convenience. For serious students of history and preparedness, the central insight is straightforward but often ignored. In an era dominated by digital networks, the ancient model offers a corrective. Sophisticated systems can fail abruptly, and when they do, survival depends on whether alternative channels exist and whether communities have practiced using them. The lost art of survival communication is not really lost. It is embedded in the historical record, waiting to be studied carefully rather than romanticized or dismissed. It reminds us that strength without coordination is fragile, and resources without signaling are vulnerable. Understanding how ancient societies transmitted information under constraint deepens our understanding of both warfare and resilience. It reveals that survival has always been as much about clarity and preparation as about force. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, where overlooked systems and quiet decisions shape outcomes more than dramatic battles, subscribe to The Prepper Historian and share this video with others who appreciate serious study of the past. The details matter, and remembering them strengthens how we prepare for the future.